From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Singapore's hawker centres are a cultural institution serving a huge variety of affordable dishes to the masses. In 2020, Singapore's hawker culture was even added to the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage. But how did hawker centres and hawker culture evolve through our history? Today, we speak to Ryan Kueh, author of the book From Streets to Stalls, The History and Evolution of Hawking and Hawker Centres in Singapore. We discuss how the colonial government managed hawking and the extensive reforms enacted by the PAP government in the late 1960s. Okay, thanks very much, Ryan, for joining us today. To start off, why did you decide to research the history of hawker culture in Singapore?
Thanks for having me, Dev. I think it's great to be here. So I think it's a great question. I think for me, I started researching the history of hawker culture in Singapore, actually really after we won the UNESCO award in 2019, 2020. I think for me as a young Singaporean, street food is quite common, and I was wondering why like Singapore won the award over, let's say, the other street food heavyweights in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. Very big street food culture as well, but only Singapore got the UNESCO award. And I think through my research, I realized that within the UNESCO nomination form, it was specifically about the space in which street food was performed, right? So specifically the hawker center. And that was what really got me interested into the history of the hawker center itself, right? I think the hawker center is a great carrier of hawker culture. And I just wanted to sort of find out more about how that came about, why is it so special to Singapore, or why is it so special in general? And then that sent me down on a deep rabbit hole of like researching the history of it. And I think I've never looked back after that. And I think it's been an interesting journey since.
What sources did you rely on for your research, and was there anything you found especially interesting?
So I think I first began, with like a literature search of like what books were available on like centers of hawker culture in general. I think there are some key books like from Lai Chi Kian, from Lily Kong, that writes about hawker centers specifically, but I think nothing too in-depth or nothing that looks at hawker history or hawker culture vis-a-vis like Singapore's general history, specifically Singapore's economic and political history. So I think that sort of got me started firstly, but as I wanted to sort of really look at the primary research materials. I think for the bulk of the book, it was based on archival resources. Went down to the archives, looked at all the different policy documents, especially during the 60s and 70s. I think that's where we have a lot of materials. But also, there are some treasure troves of like hawker reports from the 1930s, 1950s as well. And that has been like immensely sort of illuminating of how the British government saw hawking and how that contrasted with like the independent government and how they saw hawking during the Lee Kuan Yew era. I think in parts of the book as well, like for example, 14th century hawking, I think we referred a little bit more towards more historical, I guess, pieces, more academical pieces, and we try to sort of bring that to fore. And for the latter part, I think when we look at multiculturalism and I guess the sociology of hawker culture, I think I looked more towards the academic literature, I think by Teo Yo Yen and by some of the other local sociologists, how where hawker culture is mentioned, where hawker centers were mentioned, and how that sort of interplays with the everyday lives of Singaporeans.
Okay, now let's go back to the history. Why did the colonial government view hawkers as a problem, and what steps did they take in response?
So that's a great question. I think there's two parts to this, right? So I think the first is why they're a problem, right? And they're mainly a problem because of two things, right? One is that I think first is given their largely unregulated nature and given how populous they were, right, in the city, they really brought about two major issues. One is the public health issue, and the second is the urban pollution issue, right? So on the first part of public health, given that I think many of them were sort of uneducated and they were not trained in knowing how to handle food properly. They often use like contaminated water sources to prepare food and drinks, right? So for example, they'll use one water source and they'll just use that to wash the utensils throughout the day, to cook food and drinks, or maybe sometimes they will use sort of ice that was left throughout the day to prepare like cut fruits and drinks, right? And that's quite unsanitary in nature, and that caused a lot of sort of foodborne diseases, right, like typhoid. Right? They will also sort of dispose their waste into the drains, right? So once they're done with the day, they'll just throw whatever waste they have into the drain, and that sort of chokes the drains, and then it sort of attracts vermins and pests. right? So I think for the colonial government, administratively, that was one very big issue. And the second one is that given how large, given how populous they were, right, and given how unregulated they were clustered in sort of high traffic areas, right? So for example, like in the CBD area, and this causes congestions for motor vehicles and pedestrians, right? So I think these two were the biggest problems for the colonial government. And they really and this sort of persisted for quite some time, I think, from even the late 19th century all the way into the early 20th century. And I think in 1930 specifically, they sort of looked at two things. One is to mandate better legislation, right? This includes like the licensing, the identification of hawkers, because you cannot regulate them if you cannot identify who are the hawkers, right? So that's one. And the second one is to introduce some sort of like temporary hawker shelters, right? So these were like, I guess they are less permanent ideas of like hawker centers. Maybe you still see them in like, for example, like pasar malams, right? I think those can be considered as temporary hawker shelters. And those were more popular in back in the day. I think just to agglomerate the hawkers away from the crowded areas, but also to maybe introduce some sense of like hygiene standardization as well, right? It essentially ring-fenced them into a controlled space, and it also was easier to sort of control them, right? But to that effect, I think the colonial government didn't do very well, right? Eventually the problem still persisted.
Okay, so after the Second World War, why did the hawker population grow so rapidly in the late 1940s and 1950s? And what did the 1950 Hawkers Inquiry Commission aim to achieve?
I think to answer this question, we have to first understand that I think hawkers generally are, I think in the past, are a vocation of necessity, right? Many of them took to hawking only because, like, let's say, there isn't enough jobs in the market, or they were transitioning between jobs, right? And that is why in the 1930s, or even in colonial era, there was many hawkers, and most of them were Chinese or Indian in ethnicity. But this was especially pertinent, I think, after the war, right? You have huge economic devastation. The country is rebuilding, right? And after the war, there's sort of chronic unemployment, and there was also a growing population, right? So you combine that together, and then you get sort of a huge surge in hawking, right? Because if you can't find jobs outside, I think many of them sort of took to the streets, right? Sort of in their own volition, they would sort of hawk something to sort of make a living. And so that's on the supply side. But on the demand side, there's also a sort of growing demand for affordable food options, right? As many of them are much poorer now, I think they couldn't really afford to eat out as much. So that sort of drove the demand for like cheap, very affordable hawker food, largely serviced by the hawkers, right? So it was quite a tense situation because, on one hand, from the administration's perspective, on one hand, you have like a weak state, right? Post-war conditions, you're trying to rebuild the country. But on the second hand, the more hawkers there were, that sort of contributed to the public health issues, the urban pollution issues, and it sort of hindered the recovery in some ways, right? And because of that, you also have like widespread public sympathy towards the hawkers, right? So this creates a very sort of tense political situation that the colonial government had to sort of toe, right? And so I think in the 1950s, they commissioned another hawker inquiry. This time, I think not entirely by the British colonial administrators, but also with some Singaporeans or Malayans at that time, right? And I think they found two key things, right? I think one they sort of aimed to achieve they wanted to better understand what drove the hawking issue, right? So they really conducted like a mass sort of interview across the nation, and they really found that yes, most people were driven to hawking because of the social economic need of it, right? And I think that was very salient because I think that hasn't been done before, right, in Singapore's history. And eventually they led them to sort of a few recommendations, largely similar to the first commission, right? But I think that was where we really see the sort of the brainchild of like hawker centers, right? Because so there was a few recommendations that they offered. One was they proposed permanent hawker shelters. It was very interesting. So almost like to sort of be considered in consideration with like public housing, then like different housing estates in the 1950s. But these hawker shelters would be permanent and they would be sort of regulated by the government, right? So almost like, if you think about it, it's almost like hawker centers, right? And next was to sort of have a hawker-specific department, right? Which is what you have today, right? But at the end of the day, they were largely more buck than bite. Before the self-independent government, they had during the transitory phase, they didn't have a lot of resources and They didn't have enough, I guess, enforcement capabilities to sort of enforce these policies. And like the hawker specific department, for example, only came about almost 7-8 years later, right, in 1957. So I think still similar issues, right? You have enforcement issues within the colonial government, but I think that was really where you really saw the brainchild of hawker centers come to be developed. Right?
Okay, so now we are moving away from the colonial era to the post-colonial era. So when independence came, the PAP government decided to tackle hawker reforms with greater strength. I mean, one consideration that you refer to in your book was that the hawker sector deprived the country of labor for more productive industries. Could you share more about the PAP's considerations as a whole, along with the role political legitimacy played in shaping its approach?
Oh yeah, I think that's very interesting. So yes, I think like you mentioned, I think the PAP had two core considerations, one of which was economical, right? I think about 2.5%, or actually around like there were 45,000 hawkers, and that was about 2 to 3% of the population, right? So number one, economically, it deprived the economy of like human capital. Right? As Singapore was sort of industrializing, they really needed that sort of working population to be trained or either moved into productive industry. And I guess the hawker population stood as one source of that, right? So it was sort of killing two birds with one stone, right? On one hand, you could move people away from the hawking industry because that was seen as I guess less productive in nature, and on the other hand, you could sort of place them into different industries which you think were more productive and that helped to drive the industrial sort of uplifting. Right? And the second key reason why it was important for the PAP is because I think politically it was an important visual barometer of legitimacy and how effective the PAP was, right? Given that we just separated from Malaysia, I guess I think many were looking to the PAP and that first generation of leaders to really deliver on their promises, right? And I think hawkers or uplifting hawkers out of that vocation was one way to consider it, because hawkers are very visual, right? Like let's say if you go to Malaysia or Indonesia now, you look at hawkers on the street. That serves as some visual barometer of like whether there's enough economic opportunities out there, right? Secondly, also following from like the previous colonial government, hawking used to be a hot button issues, right? Where I think the colonial government lost a lot of public trust in how they managed the hawkers, and the longer there were the same number of hawkers during the PAP's tenure, right? This would slowly start to chip away at the PAP's legitimacy, right? Because then they would think, oh, the PAP is not creating enough jobs for us, right? The PAP hasn't it talks about economic uplifting, but it's more talk than action. So I think yes, I think it was important for the PAP to really tackle this problem early on, and they managed to do that. I think very effectively, and I think we can talk more about it later. But I think I also want to add that I think during that era, the PAP also had very high levels of public trust and legitimacy. I think that was one of the key differing factors from the colonial governments, right? Given that they were the first self-elected and independent government, the way that they did politics, like for example, like Lee Kuan Yew really championed the idea of grassroots politics, right? Going down to the people, walking around them, trying to understand their issues. And lastly, they had quick economic success in the late 1960s. I think a combination of that really helped to sort of solidify that and build the trust between the people, but more importantly, the hawkers, right? That what the government was doing was in the best interest of the people. Right? And I think that sort of lent a lot of credibility to the government and allowed them to enforce, I guess, more quote unquote intrusive policies, right? Or more paternalistic policies, right? As some academics would call it. Yeah.
Okay, so now we move to the period of intense reform, which is from 1969 to 1973. So what were some of the key changes and outcomes during this reform period?
A great question. I think there's generally four key instruments that the PAP introduced, or government introduced during this hawker reform era, I guess you can call it that. I think one was hawker-related legislation. Right? First, you really saw the first ever introduction of hawker-specific legislations, right? So, for example, you have the 1969 Environmental Public Health Act, which still remains today, and the 1973 Sale of Food Act, right? Both of which looks to better uplift the food safety regulations, food safety quality. It mandated like proper food training for the hawkers, or even sometimes like disease immunization for the hawkers. And that really sort of set like a standardized requirement of how safe food should be when they are sold. That's one. The second is building the hawker department. Right? I think previously mentioned there was the hawker department came into force in 1957, but they really lacked sort of manpower to enforce a lot of these hawker policies. Right? It was hard for, let's say, for example, to have a army of 30 hawker enforcers up against an army of 45,000 hawkers. Right? So I think what happened was that there was intense sort of restructuring and building of the hawker department. Manpower grew almost 2.5 times between 1965 and 1973. And there was also a large restructuring, right? They sort of allowed for higher level officers to lead urban planning and future taking activities. There was more specialized divisions within the hawkers department. And I think most importantly, officers were given the ability to issue summons. Right. So now, you can have hawker department officers go to a hawker and say like, I'm going to fine you for this without like a court appeal or anything. Right. So I think that really gave like that enforcement capability and power to the hawkers department, but also sort of changed the framing of how that sort of infringements were looked upon. Right. It was no longer like, okay, the police is targeting you, but rather like, this is a public health infringement and we are punishing you based on that. So that's the second part, hawker department capacity building. The third part is about the hawker centers, right? Which come to this. So I think the PAP really took the idea of permanent hawker shelters and they really delivered on that, right? So because once you sort of enforce, on like hawker relocation, you need to move them somewhere, right? Because if not, they'll just come back, right? And I think that you see that problem in, like, let's say, Thailand and Malaysia, right? If you enforce on illegal hawkers, what will happen is they'll just find somewhere else, another street to operate on, right? And I think the Singaporean government realized that early on and they built sort of permanent hawker shelters, right? This time alongside the public housing. And they would relocate, enforce hawkers into these hawker centers and you could only operate out of hawker centers, right? But they also needed to sort of rapidly construct these hawker centers and they did, right? Which was quite amazing. They enlisted the help of like URA, the other public agencies, some private agencies as well, to really rapidly build hawker centers alongside public housing estates. And I think by 1973, they within a span of like 2 to 3 years, they built almost 15 hawker centers. And they'll continue to build many more, throughout the 1970s. Last but not least, I think we have sort of hawker policy. So how they sort of manage this transition. I think that was quite pivotal in a way because it was very sensitive in nature. And they're sort of linked to the other economic policies or social policies that the government had at that time. Right. So, for example, you had the one hawker, one license policy. I think that was sort of the hallmark of hawker policy then, where hawker licenses were only granted to hawkers who demonstrated a social need. Right. And this was generally categorized as people who were above 40 years old. So let's say if I was a 35-year-old who wanted to be a hawker and I went to apply for a hawker license, I'll get rejected. Right. And they would refer me to the Ministry of Manpower instead for upskilling or maybe for a job placement. And they really reserved sort of hawking as a vocation for those who really demonstrated a social need. And this sort of ties into the idea of like, them needing more manpower or human capital to drive the industrial revolution, Singapore industry then. So I think, a combination of these four instruments, hawker legislation, hawker capacity building, hawker centers, and hawker policy, really sort of set Singapore's hawker landscape to what it is today. I think many of them still exist in some shape or form or another. Many of them have sort of changed as well, but this really set the grounding of how hawker policy came to be. It was very intentional. I think if I could summarize in one word, I think hawker policy design is very intentional, and I think it has sort of developed into what it is today, right? Yeah.
All right. So most of our discussion has been about historically tackling hawkers as a problem. Since then, hawker centers have become famous globally and regarded as Singapore cultural icons.
Yep.
With hawker culture now under pressure as older hawkers retire and younger Singaporeans being increasingly unwilling to join, why should Singaporeans be invested in preserving hawker culture?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that there are two answers to this. I think one for me is from a socio-economic perspective, right? Like hawker centers really it's almost like a de facto food program because it allows the government to sort of redistribute welfare indirectly by allowing for cheap food, right? Because hawker centers and hawker stores generally are heavily subsidized. It can be almost up to 8 times cheaper to rent a hawker store than to rent a coffee shop nearby. And this allows the government to ensure a low cost of living generally. I think it encourages it. It doesn't really partake in it. It doesn't really sort of enforce it forcefully. but I think it can encourages the conditions for it, right? And this allows to this keeps inflationary pressure low and cost of living low as well. And I think what is very interesting is that, for example, like in some, I guess, lower income estates in Singapore, I think academics have also found that hawker food tends to be cheaper in these areas, right? So that is a great benefit of especially for the lower income, but also for the middle class, right? It's cheap, but secondly, also it alleviates time poverty, right? I think in a nation where I think both parents work, right? Many of the times they sort of eat out rather than they dine in, right? I think in Singapore it's very common to eat out, and so much so that HDB has also sort of designed the kitchen smaller across the years, right? I think that's what some academics have found, and I think it's very interesting. Second, I think it's because of and more importantly, it's because of its multicultural element, right? I think after the ethnic integration program came about in the HDB landscape, I think it really sort of guided hawker centers into a third space of interaction for the citizens, right? Because if you think about it, hawker centers themselves are not racially quoted in some sense, but because the environment in which they operate around is racially quoted, by extension, hawker centers have to be racially quoted as well. Right? And this really allows or encourages sort of that multi-ethnic interaction and integration. Right? You can go to a hawker center, you can have like Malay food, you can have Indian food. Nowadays, you can even find like different ethnicities food, like Turkish food, Vietnamese food in the hawker center. And that I think that is a key tenet of, I guess, Singapore's policies and identities, right? The idea that we're multicultural, the idea that we're multiracial. And after a certain time, I think hawker centers now are an instrument of multiculturalism, right? And I think Singaporeans do see that as well. Singaporeans do identify that as well. And that's, I guess, how we came about to the 2019-2020 UNESCO nomination. I think one interesting last point I have to this question is that as election seasons are coming up, hawker centers are also a space for politics, or rather the space for politics, right? I think, instead of the community centers, for example, which I guess are purposely built spaces for community building, hawker centers are the space for like congregation, and the politicians know that, right? So they make an effort to go to the hawker centers. That's where the battlegrounds are for. That's where the battlegrounds are. That's where everybody is, right? And that's why politicians place so much emphasis on like going into the hawker center, showing their faces there. And I think as Singapore evolves, the hawker center will hopefully remain as this integral space. But I think it also takes some effort from both the citizenry and the government to sort of continue preserving this heritage.
Hey, so finally, to end on a delicious note, what is one hawker dish you would recommend to listeners?
Oh, one hawker dish. I think for me, it would be any curry fish that you can find. And I'd say this because I spent some time in China, and I think the Chinese were quite surprised that Singaporean Chinese knew how to cook curry fish head. And I think for me, the curry fish head is really the example of how that multiculturalism exists within Singapore, organically especially. And I would recommend anyone to sort of, I think, relook at curry fish head when you have it again, right? I think my most my favorite one thus far is this one by it's not really a hawker store, it's at a coffee shop called Zai Sun, right? And I think they're Michelin Bib Gourmand recently, but I don't think that really matters in Singapore's context. But they have a very interesting Teochew spin on curry fish head. And I think that is quite interesting. I think that sort of building on that hybridization of cultures and techniques is for me really special and quite unique. And I hope to see more of that, as we go forward in preserving this sort of hawker journey or our hawker heritage.